Hi, hello, how are you? And you're very welcome to the third week of our Sofa Symphony listening party videos. We're at the halfway point of our program of great musical works. So I hope you've been enjoying the music and these videos and the chance to interact with other music fans. We would again like to give a special word of thanks to the Healthy Ireland initiative, which is encouraging us all to stay and keep well this spring, along with the support that we also received from the Tipperary County Council and the Tipperary Arts Office in delivering this programme. In the first week, we were listening to Bach's Brandenburg concertos, and last week we listened to Beethoven's revolutionary Symphony No. 5 in C minor. We have traced the growth of the symphony orchestra from its early days of just strings and harpsichord through to the larger orchestra of Beethoven with woodwind and brass, from simpler forms such as the ritornello form to ambitious large-scale four-movement symphonies with sophisticated sonata form. The trend to get bigger and longer would continue throughout the rest of the 19th century, and other composers who would continue the legacy of Beethoven included Schubert, Brahms, Bruckner, and culminated in Mahler, where an entire movement, or an individual movement, could last for the entirety of a Beethoven symphony. It's worth noting that all of these composers were either German or Austrian, and it's easy to think that classical music itself is almost exclusively a Germanic art form. But it's not. French music has just as rich a musical heritage, from Perotin, who composed plain chant in Notre Dame Cathedral in the Middle Ages, through to the orchestral music of Rameau, and in the middle of the 19th century, Hector Berlioz arrived with his groundbreaking Symphonie Fantastique. But perhaps the most influential of them all was Claude Debussy, who was born in 1862. He was a prodigiously gifted composer who, through his unique approach to harmony, colour and form, was unlike any other previous composer. He was very rebellious in his musical approach. We can see that even in the title of this week's piece. It's not called Symphony No. 1 in F-sharp minor, and it's not even called a symphony. It's called a symphonic sketch, and it's entitled La Mer, the sea. And both those things tell us an awful lot about Debussy as an artist. He would take from other art forms, especially painting, but use them to create completely new works in music. Claude Debussy was born in Paris in 1862 to a middle-class family with no notable musical background. Despite this, young Claude's singular musical talent became evident very early. At the age of 10, he was admitted to the prestigious Paris Conservatoire, where, despite showing unquestionable talent, his unconventional musical instincts and general attitude began to frustrate his tutors. His composition professor would cover his work with angry red marks, but would, on rereading it, say, "All this is hardly orthodox, but it is very ingenious." So Debussy had a very elastic relationship with the rules of composition. And in his work, he would always be stretching them and eventually break them. Debussy is called the first of the Impressionist composers, composers whose music would use mood and atmosphere to tell their musical stories and would create a sensuous impression rather than a tuneful melody or a well-composed harmony. Impressionism as an artistic movement started with the visual artists such as Monet and Turner. And Debussy was unusual amongst composers in that he was often more artistically influenced by other art forms rather than music. Musicians, historically, are actually a very conservative bunch and tend to stick to other musicians, and usually they're not that interested in anything outside of music. His earliest works are songs by avant-garde poets like Paul Verlaine and Charles Baudelaire. He's probably the first major Western composer that acknowledges the musical world outside of Europe. Among his early and most popular piano pieces are examples of ragtime and proto-jazz. The color and the energy of Russian composers such as Rimsky-Korsakov found their way into Debussy's orchestral color too. And even moving further east, the qualities of Asian art, of space, stillness, color, were to have a massive effect on Debussy. In 1889, Debussy visited the Paris Exposition. That's the one the Eiffel Tower was built for as a temporary exhibit. And he heard for the first time an Indonesian gamelan. The gamelan is a collection of metal percussion instruments that are played by multi-instrumentalists. The resultant music is lots of layers of quick, shimmering tones, and that sounds very complex yet relaxing at the same time. And it was unlike anything Debussy had ever heard before. And we hear the influence of that music with the layers and the shifting colors in La Mer. As we mentioned earlier, since Beethoven, Germanic composers were in the ascendancy. French culture, and not just artistic culture, had been superseded by German might. In 1870, a united Germany had defeated the French army at the Battle of Sedan to bring an end, a very swift end, to the Franco-Prussian War. It was a humiliating defeat for the French, and indeed, much of European history of 20th century directly grew out of the legacy of that war. But specifically in the arts, it spurred on French artists, and especially French composers, to create great works that were also uniquely and identifiably French. It's very dangerous to make any general sweeping stereotypes about any nations, so I'll apologize now. But the difference between German and French art or intellectual thought is, you could say that German art needs to be logical, systematized, and almost mathematically provable in its conclusions. French art just wants to make something beautiful. Apologies again, but for our purposes, it suits us to say that German art is appealing to the intellect, while French art appeals to our senses. So now that I've managed to offend about 150 million people, we'll move on. In the last video, we spoke a lot about motivic development and the use of sonata form in Beethoven. You may be relieved to know you're not going to get any of that with Debussy. You're not going to get even the title of symphony. Debussy described La Mer as a set of symphonic sketches. Again, an influence from painting. La Mer falls into the category we call program music. Program music is music that attempts to tell a scene or tell a story through instrumental music. In La Mer, it is a day from dawn till dusk in the middle of the sea, with the waters in constant movement and ever-changing. The sea never quite settles, and musical ideas run through our hands while we bob along in the middle of the sea. Debussy finished composing La Mer in 1905, which is exactly 100 years after Beethoven's fifth. And even though he couldn't swim, the sea was a source of constant inspiration for him. The first movement is entitled From Dawn Till Noon on the Sea. And in it, we are set out to sea on this gently bobbing theme that enters very discreetly on the harps. These little motifs and little themes start to come in one by one. What's more important than the actual notes is the sound and the atmosphere they create, the mental images they conjure for the listener. It should feel like we're bobbing away on a small craft where there's a general sameness, but there's a lot of activity bubbling away. As the movement goes on, we hear a long journeying theme on the horns alternating with bird-like trills that's in the woodwind instruments. Halfway through, there's this dramatic change of colour, and a theme that starts in the cellos winds its way up until the movement climaxes, where the midday sun suddenly emerges from behind the clouds and lights up the entire seascape. The second movement is entitled Game of Waves. It's a fast-moving scherzo in which Debussy represents this game between the waves with the flicking of melodic ideas between various different sections of the orchestra. Along with that, the key center shifts all the time, and with it, our sense of gravity. It's subtle technique, and it calls to mind water moving around. And again, it's the colors of the orchestra and the impression on the listener's imagination that's most important. Debussy uses what's called whole tone scales to reinforce this feeling of weightlessness. Whole tone scales is a scale where each tone is a full tone away from its neighbor. There's no real feeling of resolution with these tones. They seem to just suspend in animation, and it helps with this feeling of feeling suspended in water. The third movement is entitled Dialogue Between the Wind and the Sea, and it sounds like a stormy conversation they're having. The sea's opening gambit in the low strings could have served as the inspiration for the main hook of John Williams' Jaws soundtrack. And that's only one of the similarities between this work and that film's score. The wind section then responds to this with its own theme that falls and rises and switches between major and minor keys. As a helpful hint, in this movement, the low strings will represent the sea, and the woodwind and horn section represents the wind. This dialogue continues on with increasing frenetic energy until the finale, when the sun theme from the first movement is now back, but in a far more glorious colour, and it lights up the entire seascape in all its colours, all its shades. But even that itself is only fleeting, because there's one last word of waves and we bring this symphony, but don't call it a symphony, to a stunning close. So all that remains for us now is to listen to this impressionistic musical masterwork by Debussy and to revel in the colours and in the sounds that the orchestra creates. Next week, we're going to go across the ocean and get off the continent of Europe and go to America for one of the classics of American 20th century music, Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring. But tonight, hope you enjoyed the music. Please make sure to leave your comments or your suggestions on our Discord comment page and enjoy tonight's performance. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. So the next thing you're going to need to do is click on the link below this video to open the playlist on Spotify, where you can listen to the music that we've been discussing tonight. The recording tonight we're listening to is a tremendous recording by the Lucerne Festival Orchestra under the baton of one of the great conductors of the last 50 years, Claudio Abbado. And tonight, we're able to do something a little bit special. That recording is also available to watch on YouTube. So you can decide to either watch the performance on YouTube and see the orchestra in all their glory, or you can listen to it on Spotify like we've done the last few weeks. Don't forget also to download your free PDF listening guide that gives you a guide to each of the individual movements, a couple of really interesting facts about Debussy, and a little bit of a glossary there. And you can download that. Click on the link underneath this screen. Remember to keep this Facebook event page open and to follow the comments and the questions and the interactions that's going on. And if you have any questions yourself, or if you want to share your thoughts or any suggestions that you might have, that's the place to do it. We do recommend, best practice, that you have a separate screen for the Facebook and then a separate device or a screen for the Spotify or YouTube. You can do it all on the one device, especially if it's a laptop or a desktop. But, just to kind of keep track of things, it can be better to use a second device. So without any further ado, we're going to listen to the music in a couple of minutes. And I really hope you enjoyed this one tonight. It's a great piece of music, really full of all orchestral colors and some absolutely amazing orchestral writing.